The lawyer's office was on the 14th floor of a building I had driven past 100 times, without ever expecting to walk into. And when I stepped off the elevator and saw my mother sitting in the waiting room, already, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes finding mine with the specific, careful blankness of someone who has rehearsed their expression for this exact moment, I understood immediately that whatever was inside that meeting was going to be the kind of thing that rearranges the furniture of a family, permanently, regardless of which way it went. We hadn't been in the same room in 4 years. We hadn't spoken in 14 months, and we were sitting 12 feet apart in beige chairs with a water cooler humming between us like the world's most inadequate mediator when my father walked in behind me, and then my brother, and then my aunt, and the door clicked shut, and suddenly the family that had spent years treating my absence like a weather event, they had simply learned to dress around was entirely unavoidably present in one room with me, with nowhere left to look except at what we had all been refusing to look at for a very long time. Stay with me, because what that lawyer said when he finally opened the door and invited us inside changed not just what we owned, but what we were willing to say to each other. And the most important conversation happened not in his office, but in the parking garage afterward, in the gray concrete quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, when we finally ran out of room to keep being strangers. If you've ever left a family that made leaving feel like the only reasonable thing to do, and then spent years wondering what it would take to walk back into the same room with them, subscribe right now, because this story knows exactly where you've been. I left home at 23, and I want to be precise about what leaving meant in my particular family, because it wasn't the clean, emancipatory departure people sometimes imagine when they hear stories like this. It wasn't a slammed door or a dramatic ultimatum or even a single catastrophic argument that made staying impossible. It was quieter and stranger than that, the way the most permanent decisions usually are. I left because I had spent 23 years inside a family that communicated, primarily through omission, through the things that were never said, the questions never asked, the version of me that was quietly constructed in the spaces between what I actually was and what was convenient for them to believe I was. My family wasn't abusive in the ways that generate clear, nameable categories. They were just profoundly, consistently unavailable, the way certain people are, unavailable even when they're standing directly in front of you, because they've learned so thoroughly to manage the surface of things that they've lost access to anything underneath it. My father was a man who expressed love through provision and expected gratitude to function as emotional intimacy. My mother managed family dynamics the way she managed everything else in her life, by making the uncomfortable things invisible, by rerouting every difficult conversation back to something safer and smaller, before it could develop into something real. My brother had learned, earlier than I had, to simply become whatever the family needed him to be in any given moment, which made him enormously functional within our specific ecosystem, and also, I think, quietly hollowed him out in ways he's still discovering. And me, I was the one who kept asking the wrong questions. The one who needed things named that my family had collectively agreed should remain unnamed. The one who eventually decided, on a gray November morning at 23, that living inside a language nobody else was willing to speak was making me someone I didn't want to become. So I left. I moved to a city 4 hours away, built a life that looked nothing like the one I'd been handed as a template. And for the first 2 years I tried, genuinely, repeatedly, with the specific, exhausting optimism of someone who hasn't quite accepted that the thing they're hoping for may not be possible, to maintain something with my family. I called, I visited twice a year, I showed up for Thanksgiving, and sat at a table where nobody asked real questions, and the conversation orbited the surface of everyone's lives like it was afraid to land. And then slowly the calls became less frequent, and the visits stretched further apart, and my family, with the particular passive fluency of people who have never been required to actively pursue anything they wanted, simply let the distance become the relationship, because adjusting to absence was easier for them than examining what had caused it. By year 3, I was calling on birthdays and major holidays only. By year 4, I had missed Christmas for the first time, and nobody called to ask why, which told me everything the previous 4 years hadn't quite managed to say in words. By year 5, the silence had calcified into something that had its own weight, its own texture, almost its own address. A place we all lived now, separately, without ever officially agreeing to move there. My mother texted me occasionally, brief, cheerful messages that contained no actual information about her inner life and asked for none about mine. The textual equivalent of a wave across a parking lot from someone who has decided that parking lots are as close as they're willing to get. My brother liked my social media posts sometimes, which in the economy of our family's emotional expression was practically a declaration of devotion. My father didn't reach out at all, because reaching out had never been something my father understood as part of his job description. And then, on an unremarkable Wednesday morning, 14 months into the silence, I got a call from a lawyer named Marcus Hale, who told me, in the careful, neutral tone of a man delivering information without editorial comment, that my maternal grandmother had passed away 3 weeks earlier, news I had not received from anyone in my family, which landed with its own particular, layered hurt, and that her estate included a provision requiring the presence of all named beneficiaries at a formal reading in person on a date that had been set for the following Tuesday, and that my attendance was not optional under the terms she had specified. My grandmother had apparently been very specific about the in-person requirement. Her lawyer told me she'd added it to the will herself, in a codicil written 2 months before her death, in handwriting he described as surprisingly firm for someone in her condition. I thanked him, wrote down the address, and sat for a long time afterward with the phone in my hand, thinking about my grandmother, a small, precise woman named Edna who made exceptional pie crust and never once in my entire childhood told me I was asking too many questions. If you've ever lost someone who understood you better than your own immediate family did, comment Edna below, because the grief of that specific loss is its own particular kind of loneliness. And this story is carrying it with me all the way to the 14th floor. I dressed carefully on Tuesday morning, the way you dress when you need clothing to do some of the emotional work for you. I arrived 8 minutes early, which meant I was alone, in the waiting room for exactly 4 minutes, before my mother walked in. And those 4 minutes were the last genuinely quiet ones I would have for the rest of the day. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, which happens sometimes when you hold a person at arm's length long enough. The image inflates slightly in memory, and then the real version walks through a door and you have to recalibrate. She looked at me the way she always looked at difficult things, directly, briefly, and then slightly past them. You look well, she said. Which is the thing you say to someone you love when you've forgotten how to say anything true. You too, I said back, because some reflexes survive even the longest silences. My father arrived with my brother, which told me they had driven together, which meant they had been in contact during the 14 months I hadn't heard from either of them, which I filed away in a quiet, internal folder I had been keeping for years. My aunt, my grandmother's younger sister, a woman named Patrice, who had always operated as the family's emotional thermostat, running hot when things needed warming and cold when they needed containing, came in last. And when she saw me, she did something nobody else had done. She crossed the room in 4 steps and held my face in both her hands for a moment without saying anything. And I had to look at the ceiling to keep myself from completely losing my composure in a corporate waiting room at 9 in the morning. Marcus Hale came out at 9:15 and led us into a conference room with a long table and the kind of abstract art on the walls that exist to give anxious people something neutral to look at. We arranged ourselves with the unconscious precision of a family that has spent decades knowing its own geography. My parents together on one side, my brother beside my father, Patrice, at the far end, and me on the opposite side, which meant I was facing my parents directly across the width of that table with nowhere to redirect my eyes except at them. Marcus read the standard portions of the will first, and my grandmother had been characteristically deliberate in her allocations. Specific pieces of jewelry to specific people. The contents of her house divided with the careful, annotated specificity of a woman who had thought about what mattered to whom and wanted to be sure the right things ended up in the right hands. My mother received the kitchen table, which had belonged to my grandmother's mother before her. My father received a set of woodworking, tools he had admired for years, and never thought my grandmother had noticed him admiring. My brother received the record collection, which made him cover his mouth with his hand for a second in a way that was more honest than anything I had seen from him in years. Patrice received letters, a box of them, personal correspondence my grandmother had apparently kept organized by year since 1971, which made Patrice set her hands flat on the table and breathe carefully through her nose. And then Marcus paused and turned a page, and looked up at me specifically and said, "There is a final provision, added separately from the main document, addressed to your grandmother's grandchildren collectively, with individual components for each." He slid a sealed envelope across the table to my brother first, then turned back to his papers, and then slid one to me. Same cream paper, same handwriting on the front, my name in my grandmother's script, written with the deliberate clarity of someone who wanted to make absolutely sure it arrived correctly. Marcus gave us a moment to open them privately, which I think was my grandmother's design as much as his, because what she had written inside wasn't the kind of thing meant to be read aloud to a room. I unfolded mine slowly, and I am going to read you exactly what it said, because she wrote the way she did everything, without excess, without performance, with the surgical precision of a woman who had spent 81 years deciding what actually needed to be said and ruthlessly discarding the rest. It said, "I know you left because staying was costing you too much of yourself. I never told you while I was alive that I understood this, because I was afraid that saying it would make it easier for the rest of them to let you go the rest of the way. I was wrong to stay quiet about it. I am sorry for that particular silence, which was mine and not yours to carry. The sum enclosed is not an apology from them. They will have to find their own words for that, if they ever do. It is an apology from me, for every time I watched them make you small and said nothing. Use it to build something that doesn't require you to make yourself smaller to fit inside it. And please, if you can find a way, not for them, not for me, but for the version of yourself that still remembers what it felt like before the distance became permanent, please find a way to stay in the same room long enough to say the true things. You are all running out of time to say them. And I speak from experience when I tell you that unsaid true things are the only things that don't eventually become easier to carry. I love you without qualification. I always have. Grandma Edna. Behind the letter was a cashier's check for $40,000. I read that letter 4 times before I looked up, and when I finally did, my brother was staring at his own letter with the expression of someone who has just been told something they knew but had successfully avoided knowing for a very long time. My mother's envelope was open in front of her, but she was looking at me, not at it, and her face was doing the thing it almost never does. It was completely unmanaged. No surface maintained, just the actual face underneath, the one I recognized from when I was very small, before she learned to keep it put away. My father had his letter folded in both hands and was looking at the table, and he looked, for the first time in my memory, genuinely old, not in an unkind way, but in the way people look when they've suddenly felt the weight of years they spent, looking in a direction that cost them something irreplaceable. Marcus quietly excused himself to give us the room, and the silence that followed was the fullest silence I have ever sat inside, not empty, not avoidant, but loaded with every unsaid true thing my grandmother had just given us formal permission to finally say. My brother spoke first, which surprised me, because my brother was not historically a person who spoke first. He said, "I knew you were struggling and I didn't call for a long time, and I told myself it was because I didn't know what to say. But that wasn't really it." He stopped, and then said more quietly, "I didn't call because calling meant admitting we'd let something happen that we shouldn't have let happen, and it was easier to just not." He didn't look at me while he said it, which was somehow more honest than if he had. He said it to the table, the way confessions often come most cleanly when you're not performing them for the person you're confessing to. My mother started crying before I could respond to my brother. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way someone cries when they've stopped trying to manage how they appear in a room. She said, "I didn't know how to reach you after a certain point. And instead of admitting that, I just I let the distance feel like it was something that had happened to us, instead of something I was choosing every day by not trying harder. She looked at her hands, then at me. Your grandmother told me that once, directly. I wasn't ready. To hear it then. A pause. I think I am now. My father said nothing for a long time, which was consistent. Which was the most my father thing he could have possibly done in that moment, and I had spent enough years being hurt by his silence to know that his silence now was not indifference, but rather the genuine, painful labor of a man trying to locate words in a place inside himself that had been kept locked. For so long he'd half forgotten the shape of the key. Then he said simply, I don't know how to be sorry out loud, but I am. And he looked at me with his old, tired eyes, and I believed him, not because the words were enough, but because I could see the cost of them on his face. The conversation in that conference room lasted 40 minutes, and I am not going to summarize all of it for you, because some of it belongs to us, to the specific, fragile, imperfect privacy of a family that spent a long time in separate rooms finally sitting at the same table. What I will tell you is that nobody said everything that needed to be said that day, because 40 minutes in one conference room and a lifetime of practiced avoidance are not enough raw material for that. What I will tell you is that nobody left that room pretending anymore. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother, not me. And that the absence of pretense felt, after years of almost nothing else, like the most significant inheritance my grandmother had left behind. The parking garage afterward was where it actually happened. The moment I keep coming back to, the one my grandmother had been trying to engineer with that codicil, that in-person requirement, those separate envelopes with their individual, targeted truths. My brother walked out with me, and we stood beside my car in the concrete quiet. And he said, do you want to get coffee? Not as a gesture, not as performance, just as the most basic, honest human extension of one person to another. Do you want to sit somewhere and keep talking? Now that we've finally started, I said yes, and we did. And my parents joined us, uncertainly, the way people join things when they're not sure they'll be welcome but are finally willing to risk finding out. We sat in a coffee shop for 2 hours. It wasn't a reconciliation in the tidy, conclusive sense. Nobody made grand promises about how things would be different now, because grand promises in families are almost always made on behalf of a future self. The present self doesn't yet know how to be. But we talked about real things,